Okay, well, yeah, I mean, because you right across the river, and Collinsville, and Maryville, and Edwardsville, and Caseyville, and
so I was pretty plain. I just for all of it, church and since more than 2 days, I'm
it's been a year. I keep asking my mom.
It's getting better. Like, this is the best part of what's been. We've been at 6 past. We're in progression. Today's like, I like all this stuff. It's like, but my reflection back. Last week. There's like the normal retreat.
The name is right.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it's like, they have free speed.
Okay, is this working? Yes, it is. Okay. Welcome to everybody. I know most of you. I don't know all of you. My name's Ruth Steichen, and I am a member of the Encore Ministry Board. Dottie and Bill Tennant over there at that table are our co-chairs who do a wonderful job. We try to present topics that we think are of interest to our senior citizens. By way of a few comments, when our youngest son was in college, we have 4 children, and he's the youngest, and I told my husband, I think we probably ought to, make arrangements for, our funeral so the kids don't have to mess with that. And he said, well, Michael is still in college. Would you just stop worrying about that? What's the matter? Don't you feel good? And I said, no, I feel really healthy and fine. That's why we need to do it while we're healthy. Okay, so you fast forward, and now that baby son is 35 years old. He's no longer in college, and so about 2 months ago, I finally convinced my husband to go down to Fitzgerald's with me, and we made prepaid and pre-planned for all of our funeral arrangements. And it feels good to have it done. And so I asked the rest of the board if they thought it would be a topic that people would like, and they said yes. And so thank you for showing up. And we're going to start with Father Vince kind of just giving an overview of what the Catholic Church teaches about funerals and disposal of the body. And then Lance Acree from Fitzgerald's Moore is going to take over for the rest. Some people have said they have a deadline, so if you have to pick up and leave, we understand, that's okay. The meeting can last as long as you need it to last. If you have questions and you want to stay, if you don't have questions and you want to leave, just do whatever suits your schedule. And so I think with that said, and next month on November 10th, we will have a follow-up session with Sharon Hanisch, our Faith Formation Director, and Lyndon Meyer, our church liturgical musician director, about the possibility of pre-planning your own funeral liturgy. What songs do you like? What readings do you like, etc. So keep that in mind too. Okay, Father Vince, please.
It's always good to start with a prayer. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day, for gathering us together, for the gift of life, but also the gift of eternal life with you. We ask that you be with us as we talk about these last things, have our hearts open to your will, and we ask this through Christ our Lord, amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, I won't take too long because I can't really talk, but most of it's on this sheet that you got. And kind of things I want to highlight, you could read it on your own, but one thing that kind of priests talk about a lot in terms of kind of funerals and things like that is kind of those moments before death, right? When someone's in hospice or someone's kind of close to death. A mistake people often make is in terms of administering the last sacraments, they'll wait till the last moment, right? If, they just started hospice, they're gonna be around for 3 weeks or a month, we won't call a priest till, it's really close. Well, that makes it tough because there've been situations even in my youth as a priest. I've showed up somewhere and the person's already dead. And what's sad is you can't administer sacraments to a dead body. And so I couldn't anoint the person, couldn't hear the confession, couldn't give them communion. I could pray over them and say prayers like that, but what's really important is to receive these final prayers. And the church doesn't call them last rites anymore. That's not a thing we do. So people still ask for last rites. Just say can you receive final sacraments? And as I mentioned, it's anointing of the sick, right? To kind of prepare the soul for its final moments. If the person's conscious, I'll ask them if they want their confession heard, which is always good, right? Sneak that confession in before, you pass away there. And then receiving the Eucharist, which is called viaticum, which is food for the journey, right? To sustain them as they pass from this life to the next. And there's also a special prayer called the Apostolic Pardon, which is an indulgence for the remission of temporal punishment due to sin. So it's pretty much like how any indulgence would work, right? In terms of the time you would spend in purgatory, God willing, this prayer would alleviate that, right? The apostolic pardon. But once again, the person has to be alive, right, to receive these things. So just got to keep that in mind. I know it's kind of morbid to think about, but like, you know, eventually we're all going to be there at one point, right? So to get those last sacraments, even if someone rallies and, you know, they're still kicking for another like 10 years, right? That's great. But like, it's better to be safe than sorry, obviously, right? And in terms of our funeral service, there's often kind of three specific rites that happen. So there's the vigil, often the night before. There's a funeral mass, and then there's a rite of committal. So the vigil, probably seen a rosary. Sometimes people do eulogies then, or they have some words. That can either be in the church or that can be at the funeral home. Funeral mass, obviously, in the church, right? And after that is the rite of committal. And so that's, we go to the cemetery, and we bury the body. All of these often are led by the priest. Often a deacon will do the vigil service. You can request who or whom you want to do that. And then in terms of burial, it's still kind of the primary means of how we dispose of a body, right? So either in a gravesite or a chapel or a mausoleum. This often happens at the rite of committal. And then, just a quick note about cremation. It wasn't until 1963 that the church allowed cremation to be permitted. And the reason is, even though the person's soul is no longer there, it's still their body, right? We are body and soul. And so we have great respect for the human body. And so when it comes to cremated remains, what was difficult is like, that could kind of get messy, right? You have all these ashes and, people want to scatter them, things like that. So the church does not allow that, right? The scattering of ashes or the keeping of an urn on like your mantle or, on your bathroom shelf or whatever, right? That's not a great respect for a body, because like we said, even though it's burned up remains of a human body, we would still say it's the same body, right? You wouldn't keep a dead body in your house, right? So that's why you have these remains that you treat the same. Obviously, it goes back to the teaching of the resurrection at the end of time, right? That at the end of time, our souls and bodies will be reunited, right? And so to have that same respect for the body is needed. But now, obviously, you can get cremated, and it can be, but as long as it's buried, right? That it's in the proper place, in a grave or mausoleum or whatever. That's about it. That's all I had. Do you guys have any questions specifically? Yes. Yeah, are you talking about like anointing the sick? Yeah, you can receive that multiple times. So it's often if you have a major surgery or a persistent illness, that's what anointing the sick is for, but also kind of at the hour of death. And if you ever get a hold of a priest anointing the sick book, there's a bunch of different prayers for specific situations. So like a prayer for right before a major surgery, or prayer for a lingering illness, and then a prayer for like moments before death. So we can receive that sacrament kind of over and over again. So it's a good question. Great. Any other questions? Cool. All right. I'll hand it over.
My name is Lance Acree. I'm with Fitzgerald Funeral Homes. Fitzgerald, as some of you may know, are all in one and the same company. That happened a number of years ago. So you'll see some folders that I passed out as you came in. That'll have a mixture of information, some general brochures and general information on pre-planning, and my card as well. So just wanted to point that out. So I want to start out, just tell you a little bit about myself, and why pre-planning is personally important to me, aside from the fact I've done it for a really long time. So I've been with Moore Fitzgerald Funeral Homes a total of about 8 years. However, I've been in the business for a little over 20 years. And when I started in the business, I was 19, jumped into it very early. And at that time, my very best friend, who I grew up with, he lived across the street. I spent more time with him than my blood brother. And at the same time I went to the funeral profession, he went into the military. And he served a couple of tours. He went through Bosnia, Afghanistan. And about 4 years later, I got a call from his mother, and he had been killed in a motorcycle accident, a tragic motorcycle accident, which, he had been through so much overseas in the military, and then for that to happen, it was mind-blowing. But at that time, when she called me, she wasn't calling just to let me know and notify me of what happened. She was calling me for help. I'm the funeral professional. And I'll tell you, at that time, the grief, the shock set in so quick that everything I knew about the funeral industry as a whole just disappeared from my brain. I couldn't think. And I basically had to set aside my grief at that moment and what I was going through and go into business mode to be the professional, to help her through that process. And no one should have to do that. And by pre-planning, essentially, you can prevent that from happening and let family focus on the important part, which is, a healthy grieving process and a celebration of life. It was especially difficult because he had a fiance. He was soon to be married. So she had some preferences in what she wanted, but at the same time, she's not the legal next of kin. His mother was. But she tried to, take into account her preferences, so it was a bit of a tightrope walk. Thankfully, having been in the funeral profession, I did at least have enough time to talk with Nick, that was my friend, even in a jovial sense, just when we would talk sometimes, and he gave me some ideas of what he wanted when that time came. So that in itself was extremely helpful to me, just to know a few of the little preferences of what he wanted, and it really did help throughout that process. So I realized at that point just how powerful pre-planning is, even if it's nothing more than some conversations with family members and loved ones, to give them an idea of what type of service you want, and just give them some kind of guide. So, although I've done this for a long time, it really struck me personally just how important that is. Now, to tell you just a little bit about Moore Fitzgerald Funeral Homes, as I mentioned, it's all one same company. It was a little over 10 years ago, Moore's and Fitzgerald's merged. And both have been around since the 1930s. We now have 6 locations. We have 2 Fitzgerald's locations, one in downtown Tulsa, one at 91st and Harvard. And then we also have our Moore's locations, which is at 51st between Memorial and Mingo, 19th and Memorial, 25th and Harvard, and 14th and Peoria. So a number of different locations to serve Tulsa. One of the things that sets us aside from a lot of funeral homes that people just don't know unless you've kind of been immersed in it is that we do everything in-house, meaning we have our own private crematory. We do our own cremations. That's pretty rare. Most funeral homes assume that, or most people assume that a funeral home that offers cremation does it themselves. Most funeral homes hire out that service. So when we do it, it ensures that your loved one is in our care throughout the entire process. The other big thing is we also do our own what we call removals, which is picking up your loved one when that person passes. And that's extremely important because we're there. We keep someone at the funeral home 24 hours a day, not at home on call, but our staff at the funeral home 24 hours a day. So when we get that call, we're out there very quickly, usually within 30 minutes, or if it's extra distance, maybe an hour. Most other funeral homes do hire out that service, and where that can sometimes be an issue is they can be tied up serving other funeral homes throughout the city that have gotten many calls, and they get backed up. I had a hospice worker that I worked with some months back, and when she found out it was our funeral home coming, and when I got there, she said, "I'm so glad to hear it was you guys because I know you're here quick." She said she had waited upwards of 5 hours not too long ago for someone to get there just because they were backed up because the funeral home doesn't do that themselves. So a lot of little things we do ourselves, still privately family owned and operated, which is extremely important, especially when it comes to the service that you receive because the service is so personal. It's not just business as usual. Our funeral directors really have the compassion and the love, and their heart is really in it. So it makes a big difference. So I just wanted to point those things out. So just talking about pre-planning and why it's so important. Pre-planning in itself is a true gift for your family, because when a death occurs, there is a ton of information that the funeral home has to have, in addition to decisions that have to be made. And as you can imagine, for a lot of you here, talking about funeral planning, it's not the easiest thing, not the most comfortable, definitely not what someone considers enjoyable. But I will tell you, if you don't want to talk about it, your family definitely doesn't want to talk about it when something's happened. So you have the power to put an intentional plan in place to make what can be a really difficult process a little bit easier under the circumstances. And essentially, when you pre-plan, there's two parts to the process. The first, as I mentioned, which I'll focus on now, is the information. So when I say information, the first part is what's called vital statistics. This is information that the state requires for a death certificate. Some of it's a bit more basic, some of it's a bit more detailed. A lot of it's birth certificate information, your name, your date of birth, your address, and so forth. But some of it gets a little more in-depth as far as your usual occupation, what type of business or industry that was in. Well, many people have done multiple things, but you can only list one. All the way down to your parents' names, their place of birth. All that's required for a death certificate. Then there's who do you want in charge of the arrangements. Now, if it's a spouse, it's pretty straightforward. But if you have multiple children, oftentimes there's kind of one that is kind of the front runner, the main point of contact. So that's important to determine. The other is the details of the service, where you want that service. If it is going to be, a mass at the church, is it going to be, graveside services? There are a lot of different options there. One of the other things that a lot of people overlook are the little details, or, are there certain hymns that you want for the Mass? What are you going to wear? That is a very important one. Some of these things may sound insignificant, but I can promise you when a death's occurred and we're asking the family, all they want to know is what you would have wanted. And I always tell a little story about a lady that had passed away. Her husband had predeceased her some years before. And there were two daughters that came in to make arrangements with us. And when going through all the details, we said, okay, we know mom's got a ring on. Is that to stay with her, or do you want that back? And the first daughter said, no, mom wore that long after dad passed away even. We're going to bury that with her. And the eldest daughter said, no, when I was 18, mom said I could have that ring when she passed away. And the conflict is on. And it's one of the worst possible times that you can have a conflict like that. And I'll tell you, and as you can imagine, the emotions run a lot higher than normal circumstances. So again, they may sound like insignificant details, but it really can just eliminate any conflict or any issue, going down the road there. The other thing is where the final place of resting will be. And whether that be, a cemetery, or some of the Catholic churches have columbariums for cremated remains. Now, another thing I always like to touch on just a little bit is visitations or viewings, open casket. A lot of people don't know or realize that is an option with cremation. And what you can have is a full viewing and visitation or rosary before the cremation takes place. The body can even be present, for the Mass and everything. And, a lot of people, when they do cremation, it's because it's more simple, more cost effective usually. So viewing is not usually a concern or something they want to do, but it is an option. And even for people being traditionally buried, there's a lot of people that say, well, I don't want anybody seeing me after I pass away. I want them to remember me how I was. And I totally get that. And many people in my family are that way. But one thing I always just make a point to really reiterate is that funerals, they're about the person that passed away, but they're for the benefit of the living. And when it comes to visitations and viewing and being able to spend time and see their loved one, it's very polarized with people. You have some people that, say, I have to, it's very important. Closure, it's a big deal for them. They need to see their loved one before everything's all said and done. And you have the others that, as I mentioned, say, I just want to remember them as I last saw them. So when you take these things into account, yes, ultimately it's your decision, it's your arrangements, but try and think about what the family will want, what's going to help them through that grieving process. Because at the end of the day, it's to help them through a difficult time. So something to consider that a lot of people overlook that I always like to touch on. Now, one of the biggest questions we get, of course, is on prepaying funerals. Now, I want to make it explicitly clear, pre-planning and prepaying a funeral are totally independent of each other. It's extremely important, and I recommend everyone pre-plan. Everybody should have a plan in place. That doesn't mean you have to prepay your services. Some people are afraid to even start the process because they think, well, I'm not ready to talk about the financial end. It's okay. The planning is the most important part. The pre-funding, whether you do or not, is totally up to you. When we meet with families and I sit down, I'll show you how that works, the benefits to it, but whether you choose to is up to you. But I'll explain how that works and what that looks like. So we, as most funeral homes, whenever you actually prepay a funeral, it's a product of insurance. It's a policy. You've heard the term a burial policy or a funeral policy or a cremation policy, and that's what it is. And there's a number of reasons that funeral homes go this route. The biggest is your funds are protected. So used to years and years ago, if you prepaid a funeral, and I mean years ago, you paid it directly to the funeral home. But if they mismanaged funds or went out of business, you could lose your money. So when we write a prepaid funeral, it's a contract through us, which locks in your costs, and I'll touch on that in a moment as well. But your funds are protected because you own that policy. It's in your name. It's assigned to us, and it'll pay us when the death occurs to take care of all the goods and services, but you own it, so your funds are protected. The big part I just touched on also is you can freeze the cost. That's one of the big financial arrangements, benefits behind that arrangement. When you prepay a funeral, it's a contract also through the funeral home so that all of our charges, all of our goods and services and merchandise, it's frozen in cost. So it doesn't matter how much that funeral can go up in cost, your price is locked in. And the way that works, and some people ask, well, how's that possible? If I prepay it now and I live 30 years, how does that work? Well, when you prepay that funeral and it goes into a funeral policy, that policy is going to provide us growth. It's going to grow a little bit. Now, we hope as a funeral home, from a business standpoint, it keeps up with our rising costs and inflation. But if it doesn't, you're contracted in and we eat that. So if it comes up short, that's for us to deal with. Here's the interesting part a lot of people don't know. If somehow that growth ended up growing in that burial policy more than what our costs were at the time someone passed, they call it growth over retail. By law, we have to refund that. So even if somehow that investment worked out so well that we grew that money and it was more than the cost of your funeral by the time you passed away, we have to refund it. So you win either way. If it comes up short, we eat it. If it comes ahead, then we have to refund that. So just strictly from a financial investment, it's a great investment because your funds are protected and your costs are locked in. That's a big advantage. Another question that we get a lot about is transferability. So because it's in a policy that's assigned to us, you can move and it can be transferred elsewhere. So I had a lady a couple of years ago, she called me and said, hey, Lance, I moved to Florida. My kids are here in Florida. I'm not in Tulsa anymore. How do I get this transferred? I remember you said we could do that. I said, no problem. Find you a funeral home that you like in Florida, whether one that's recommended, look up some reviews, whatever the case may be, and basically take them the paperwork, or they can call me and I can send it to them, and essentially they transfer it. It's just reassigned to where that funeral home is now going to render all the goods and services that we originally were. So it's a very simple process, and the beauty in that is that funeral home now gets the growth it's been growing. So it's almost like they originally wrote it because they're going to get all the growth that it was originally growing in the very beginning. So transferability is very simple. It's not like you make arrangements with a funeral home in town and you're stuck with it there. It can be easily transferred anywhere in the country. So that's very simple. The other big one is payment arrangements. Only when you're pre-planning and pre-arrangements can you make monthly payments. Of course, you can just outright pay for it at once in one lump sum and it's done. But a lot of people, financially, it's in their best interest, or financially they're required to with their budget, to make monthly payments. And there are payment options from anywhere from a 3-year monthly to a 5-year monthly. If you're young enough, there's even a 10 and a 20-year monthly. So there's a lot of different options available. The interesting part is because it is a policy, because it is insurance, you're covered, you're insured during that time. So what that means is as you're making monthly payments on that prepaid funeral, you're covered by the insurance within it. Part of that monthly payment is insurance coverage that protects you so that if you're paying on that, and God forbid you passed away during that time, it's paid for. The family doesn't have to come up with that money. Because the biggest reason that people pre-plan is to keep that burden off their family, and if they have to come up with money to pay off a funeral, that can be tough for a lot of people. So there's insurance coverage that's built into that would pay it off if a death occurred as you're making monthly payments. So that's a huge advantage. So those are the main points of how a prepaid funeral works, in a nutshell. But one of the things that we offer that very few other funeral homes do in terms of prepaid funerals, which ironically is independent of a prepaid funeral, you can have it all on its own, is a service called out-of-area protection. And out of area protection, essentially, what that does, it's an insurance you can buy. It's $499. And if you pass away anywhere beyond 75 miles from home, anywhere in the world, it pays everything to get you back home. And as people travel a little bit, and you know, the older you get when you start to travel, it becomes more of a concern. And the great part is, it doesn't, just because it's an insurance, it doesn't just pay the fees. It's not a reimbursement. This company called Medical Air Services Association, and it's in the brochure that you've got, it's a brochure within the packet you've got, they do all the work. And there's a lot involved. You have to call a local mortuary service to pick up the body. You have to file for transit permits. If it's not close enough to drive, they have to fly. There's a lot of moving parts in addition to the extra costs that are involved that are completely taken care of. So it's a great peace of mind when you're talking about prepaid funerals, because we've seen it happen many times. It happened with my grandmother. She lived in Mississippi. My aunt lived in Atlanta. My family's here from Oklahoma. Well, they all happened to be together, which was a rare thing. And it was, looking back, it was sad at the time, but looking back, it was very interesting and almost, it was a God thing how it happened. But they were never together all at once. It's very rare. Well, my grandmother was hysterical, and she was always funny. And she's in the back seat, and it was a really hot day, and she said, "Girls, you're going to need to have to turn this air conditioner up. I'm going to die back here." And seriously, in a couple of minutes, she passed out, and she was gone, just like that. And I promise you, that is the honest truth. And if you knew my grandmother, you have to kind of smile a little bit. So I'm like, we called her Nanny. That was Nanny. So, but there was a lot involved to get her back home. We had to make all those arrangements and pay the costs, and and all the little details in between. So you don't think about it happening. No one plans on it. But if you travel at all or leave town much, if it's at all a concern or something that you just don't want to even have to worry about messing with, that's something that we offer. So that's, again, even independent from prepaid funerals. I had a gentleman that went on he was a missionary, and he was going across country for 6 months. We had talked about prearranging and him prepaying his funeral. He said, "Listen, I've got to wait on that part, but this out-of-area protection, can I still do that?" I said, "Absolutely." So he did, and knowing that he'd be cross country for an extended period of time, and God forbid if something happened, then it would get him back home. So that's something that you can do independently from a prearranged funeral, prepaid funeral. So as a whole, that's generally how pre-planning works. Now, what I do is, and I always tell people, again, going back to what I said earlier, prearranging a funeral is independent from prepaying it. And I always recommend, for people to schedule a time, sit down with me. There's absolutely no pressure. I'll help you pre-plan. There are some things you hadn't thought about. That's great going through that process. And if you want, I'll show you the prepayment options as well. Whether you do that or not is totally up to you, but at least get that prearranged. And then what we do is put it on file. The big thing, even if you don't prepay it, we'll put those arrangements on file at the funeral home. That way, if something happens, it can be found, because so often we have family that comes in and says, Mom or Grandma, they had this all written down, we just can't find it. And of course, it doesn't do them a whole lot of good that way. So we put prearranged arrangements on file, and that can even be the picture you want if you want to write up your obituary. Because remember, you can go as in-depth when it comes to pre-planning as you want. Some people just want to say, I want to be cremated, I want to have my service this way, I want my ashes here, and that's it. And that's okay. You've made a great plan, and it's going to help your family tremendously. But I've had people go to the nth degree, everything from hymns or songs picked out, exactly where they'll be, headstone or marker already put up, what they're going to wear picked out, everything from A to Z. So there are different levels to it, but at least having that conversation with your family, sitting down, documenting that information, it's extremely powerful, and I can't recommend it enough. So if my information's in there at any point in time, and I'll hang around a little bit afterwards too. If anybody wants to come visit with me, you can always schedule a time, and I'll visit with you. But I always like to, if we got time and if it's okay, open up. If anybody has any questions, usually people have some general questions on how things work. Does anybody have any questions?
Where is your office located? If we were to do this and come in, you've got all the locations listed. Where are you?
So if you'll notice, my business card has all 6 because I arrange for all of them. So you tell me which you would prefer, and that's where we'll meet. So it's about what's most convenient for you. And also, I'm mobile. I do a lot of appointments in families' homes. Sometimes it's more convenient for them. It's more comfortable for them. So I can even come to your home as well. So you just let me know which location you want to meet at, and that's the one we would visit at.
Will you repeat the questions back so they can catch it on the camera? Like, when people ask questions, will you say it back?
Oh, absolutely. You bet. And she was just asking there if what location that we could meet at, because we have 6 locations and all of them are on my business card. I'll meet at any location you want. So you just let me know which location you want to meet at, and that's the one that we'll meet at. Yes, ma'am.
So, when my mother was put on hospice, my brother and I went to the funeral home to pre-plan it and go ahead and pay for it because we knew we had a couple of months before she was going to pass. But they told us that we can only pay for a certain portion of the funeral, and I don't remember exactly, but it had something to do with her Social Security. So how does that play into the prepaying that you're speaking of?
Okay, so you're talking about when prepaying at a family member that was going on hospice or was on hospice and wanted to prearrange and prepay that funeral, but then there were some things they said you couldn't prepay and it had something to do with Social Security. Is that right?
That's what I remember.
Okay, so you absolutely can come in, prearrange, and prepay for someone that is on hospice. Now, there are always going to be some variables when you do prepay, and to answer the question about Social Security, that's usually completely independent. Social Security, the only bearing that typically has is with Social Security, depending upon how and when you're paid, sometimes they can withdraw a payment back. So sometimes people are using or banking on using those funds that are available to pay for some of these costs, and sometimes the funeral home will warn them, depending upon when they get their Social Security can take that back. And when I say take it back, they'll reach in the account and take it. It's not a request or a formal request, it's just gone. So we do warn families that, if you're using those funds, be aware of that. But aside from that, no, you can pay for anything and everything you want to, even if someone's on hospice. And the only things that can fluctuate, because when you prepay a funeral, and even when I sit down with someone, whether on hospice or whether this is prearranging years in advance, there's an area of cost that you can cover that can fluctuate by the time a person passes, the things that aren't our charges. So for example, let's say you wanted to put an obituary in the newspaper. You never know how much it's going to cost until that day comes, because the paper can double their prices tomorrow, which over time they've gone up quite a bit, but the exact amount won't be known. So what we do is we recommend to estimate. I even keep, when I prearrange, a little book of recent obituaries we did, how much they actually cost, so you could get an idea of how much gets you how big of an obituary, and we'll estimate that in there. And then when the person actually does pass, we'll take the obituary they wrote, we'll submit it to the paper, they'll give us a quote, and then you basically just pay the difference. If it was more than what we estimated or less, then we refund it. So we just adjust it from that way. But yeah, in Social Security, usually it won't have anything to do with prepaying a funeral, other than if you're using funds that you're expecting that were from Social Security payment that could be taken back. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The ashes to a different state. Is there any rule on how to do it, or can you just take them and carry it?
So
What was the question?
So the question is, when someone's cremated, is there an issue with transporting cremated remains? And I'll tell you a couple of different ways those cremated remains, we call them cremains if you ever hear that term, because there are a number of different ways, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that works. So when a cremation takes place, we have to get a permit from the medical examiner's office. When we get the permit from the medical examiner's office, before we're allowed to cremate, we can request what's called a transit permit. And that transit permit, essentially, that is your documentation and proof that you can take those across state lines. Some states actually want to see that, and it's an issue. Some, it's not a big deal. Now, if you fly, there is a particular way the urn has to be accessible. They can't be sealed up. They are probably going to want to open it up. There are certain materials that they'll frown down away from. There's kind of a checklist of how that needs to be done, but it can be flown with. The other thing that's become quite common is you can actually mail the cremated remains. And when you do that, only the U.S. Postal Service will do it. They have a very specific way and how it has to be wrapped and done. Yeah, the other UPS, the other ones, they won't touch it. They don't want anything to do with the liabilities behind that. But the United States Postal Service, they will. Last I checked, it was about $100. But that can be very convenient because, if someone passes here but they want their ashes buried in, California where they've got family, the ashes can be shipped to California. The family can take them from there and then make whatever arrangements for permanent placement there.
Have these rules all changed since 9/11?
Not the rules haven't per se, to my knowledge, although I could be wrong, other than just how the container is brought on a plane. Because, being able to access it, open it up, I honestly don't know if possibly before 9/11, if they were a little bit more relaxed and if it was already sealed up, they'd let that go. But definitely, as you know, after 9/11, anything that they wanted to look into or be able to lay eyes on, that would be one of them. But even before 9/11, you could still fly with an urn, and of course even after. So just the type of container and the accessibility to be able to look into it was the primary focus. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, do you have cremation facilities in all 6 of your facilities?
So.
And that's what part 1. Part 2 is, do you give tours? Can we actually see your cremation and freezer part, the freezing part, and among all the rest of the chapel and all the rest of it?
Right. So your first question being, do all 6 locations have a crematory? So what we do is we have our crematory. We have one, and it is at our 25th and Harvard location. And all of our cremations are done right there. We have a crematory specialist. All of our cremation permits come through there. So everything is funneled into one location and kept together. So all the cremations are done there. Absolutely, you can tour the facility. In fact, you can even be present for the cremation if you wish, and we offer that often because, again, going back to funeral homes that don't do their own cremations, that's not an option. So one of the things that we allow is for a family to come in, see their loved one before the cremation takes place, be there while the cremation takes place, and then take possession of those cremated remains afterwards. And for many, that's comforting because that ensures that really is their loved ones, their family members, their family members' ashes. And then as far as touring facilities, absolutely, any chapel, anywhere, you can at any time schedule a time to view the crematory or any of the other locations, chapels, facilities in general. Absolutely, anytime. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Recently attended a funeral here. The remains were at the funeral. The person died a week before, 10 days. I don't recall exactly. What is the timing of cremation?
How long does it? Okay. So your question is, how long does cremation take? Okay. So there's the part that delays it slightly is no funeral home's in control of, and that is you have to get a permit, a medical examiner's cremation permit, to be able to do the cremation. And the process for that basically is the medical examiner doesn't necessarily see the body. There's not an autopsy. They just want to look at the medical files. They want to look at the age. Is this an expected death? Okay, that looks normal. They sign off on an issue. But it gives them the opportunity to look at it and say, this person was young. They really didn't have any medical ailments. I want to look into this a little bit more because once a cremation takes place, there's no forensics there. That's the only thing that does take on average, and it can vary. We've been seeing it take 2 to 3 days. We always tell people about 3 days on average that it takes to get that permit. So although we're able to do a cremation right away, we can't until we get that permit. Now, during times where like COVID, the medical examiner's office was really backed up. It did take extra time, and it did take upwards of 5-6 days, sometimes a week to get that permit, and we couldn't do anything without it. But under normal circumstances like we're in now, usually 2 to 3 days. We always say 3. That way, if it's done a little quicker, then we'd rather under promise and over deliver.
I just like the idea of having the remains at the funeral.
Absolutely. And when we arrange, when we're scheduling a service, a funeral, and someone wants the cremated remains there, we'll always make a point to say, don't schedule it yet until we have the permit, because we've seen cases where they're adamant, we need to schedule it, they go ahead and do, but then the permit isn't coming in time, and then you can't have the cremated remains there because we can't do that cremation until we get the permit. So you always tell people, because once we get that permit, we can do the cremation that day. So we always advise wait till we get the permit, and then we'll go ahead and schedule it just to be safe. Yes, sir.
Besides being buried in a federal cemetery, what other VA benefits are there?
So there are VA benefits. Now, speaking of cremation, since and your question was what other benefits are there, or benefits specifically related to from the VA and that for a veteran. So one of them, just since we were talking about cremation, that a lot of people don't know is even if you're cremated, if you qualify, you honorably discharged, you have a DD-214, it wasn't just reserved, you served active duty, then you can actually have your ashes interred at one of the national cemeteries, Fort Gibson, Fort Sill, one of those, and they cover it for the veteran and spouse completely. That's a great benefit. Even if you're buried at a private cemetery, like one in town, the VA at that point, they won't cover plot, they won't cover most of the cemetery costs, but they will cover the veteran's marker or headstone, if you will. Usually a 24 by 12 bronze plaque. It comes in granite also, depending upon what the cemetery will allow in that area. But that's one great benefit. And even in some cases, a husband and wife will say, well, no, we want to do our own stone, but they'll order that VA marker and use it as a foot marker. And that can be great, just having it there in general, whether it's as a foot marker or at the top. That way, for cemeteries that do special things during Memorial Day or Veterans Day, they'll put little flags out if they see something that says they were a veteran. They'll honor that veteran's service. So those are the couple of benefits. The one that's a little tougher to qualify for, that most veterans don't, but some do, and this one kind of slips between the cracks because a lot of the benefits, like being buried at the VA cemetery or the headstone I mentioned, the funeral home helps you with that. We coordinate it. We have the application. We just get your discharge paperwork and that kind of thing. But the one that can slip through the cracks sometimes is you might be eligible for a burial/funeral reimbursement from the VA. And what that means is you have to qualify for it, and you have to apply directly, because the VA, they won't track you down to let you know you may qualify. You've got to know to apply. And the main qualifications to qualify for that is if you're 100% disabled from military service, or if you were retired military, have a pension from the VA, or if you pass away in a VA nursing home or hospital. If either of those three apply, that's the main qualification. And then from there, they look at, was the death service-connected? And then it pays a little more, like $1,500 to $2,000. Or if the death was not service-connected, it's usually like between $300 to $800. So there are some of those benefits that you're potentially entitled to, and I always ask, when sitting down with a family, if they are a veteran, and I'll touch on those. Yes, sir.
Will your funeral home take care of the arrangements for the military part of the funeral?
Yes, so your question is, will our funeral home take care of the military part of the arrangements for that funeral? Yes. So we do all that. So whether it be honor guard, having taps played, the flag folded, whether it be burial at the VA cemetery, any part, the VA headstone that we talked about, all that we ask is that the family provide us the DD-214, which is the technical term for that discharge paperwork, and then we help you complete those applications, and we make that contact to arrange that. We sure do. Yes, ma'am.
You donate your body, does the funeral home get involved with that?
Say that one more time.
If you donate your body for medical research, does the funeral home get involved with that?
Does the funeral...
The funeral home get involved with that?
Oh, okay. So your question is, if you donate your body like to science, does the funeral home get involved in that? Typically, no. Most of that is actually arranged directly through the programs that do that. There are a couple in Tulsa. There's OU, and then there's OSU. OSU is the one I see the most. They have a pre-registration program which you want to take part of because you want to pre-register, because people that kind of plan on doing that and then think when the time comes, I just want it donated, oftentimes they can deny you. So you want to pre-register, which is still no guarantee, but that's your best bet. And they basically will keep the body. It's usually somewhere around 6 months. It kind of varies. And then once they're done, they'll cremate afterwards, and then they'll send the ashes back to the family. And through that process and working with them, you can file for a death certificate through the state of Oklahoma. So it's really an independent process of the funeral home. Even having the body picked up, the body donation program arranges that. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you touch on
viewer that's watching at home about the green burial?
Yes. So about green burials. So green burials, the concept is, to be as, of course, as the name implies, as green as possible. Which really what that looks like is, in a true green burial scenario, no embalming, no casket, you're wrapped in a shroud, and then buried in a cemetery that's designed for green burial. And in those cemeteries designed for that, there's no markers or headstones. It looks just like a field. So it's very natural. In some of those cases, they may have like a memorial wall that has a name of each person who might be buried out there in a green burial, but not always. That's a true green burial system. Now, we easily can arrange for that because we take care of, no embalming and transportation and with the shroud and all that. The trickier part in Tulsa is what cemeteries might offer green burial. That's the trickiest part. Because as you may know, a lot of cemeteries, they require a vault, they require a casket, they have a lot of requirements. So I researched this some time ago, and it's been about 8 months ago. Of course, there could be some changes or cemeteries that have added some options since then. But there were a couple of main options. The closest in town was the cemetery in Sand Springs. It's Woodlawn. I always get mixed up between the two, but it's the main one in Sand Springs. And they have an area where no embalming. They will allow a very basic wood casket or just wrapped in a shroud. And then instead of it just being a field with no individual marker or memorialization, they will allow a native stone. And by native stone, a stone that originated from Oklahoma, that's natural from Oklahoma, that can have an inscription with your name on it. For the closest area, that's about as close as you can get to green burial in this near area. However, if you're willing to go as far as Stillwater, closer, going close to Perkins, I believe it is, they do have a true green burial cemetery portion there, where there is no embalming, there's no stone, it's only to be wrapped in a shroud, which is the true way of green burial, if you will. So there are some options for that. It's just a little bit limited in Tulsa, only because we're still in the Bible Belt. The green burial is something that's making its way here, but just not quite as popular as like on the East and West Coast. But it's definitely an option, and by all means, just to kind of touch on the idea of green burial. When it comes to embalming, a lot of people are confused about embalming and when that's required, when it's necessary, and when it's not. And basically the way that works is if you have an open casket public visitation or viewing where the public is exposed to the body, that's when by law we have to embalm. But in cases where someone says, no, I want a closed casket, it's not to be open, I don't want anyone seeing me, the casket's closed throughout that time, you do not have to be embalmed. And even in that case, the law will allow us to do what we call an identification viewing. An identification viewing means it can be just a few family members, immediate family members, maybe 20 minutes or so, and it gives them an opportunity to see them, yes, identify, but to be able to see them, know that that's them before everything else takes place. There's no charge for that. You do not have to be embalmed. Again, to be embalmed legally, you just, to be a requirement, you have to have an open casket public visitation or viewing. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What if you had donated on your driver's license? I guess it's the eyes, and I'm not sure what else we take.
Mm-hmm.
But where do they take those out?
So they do have facilities, and it depends because there's different levels to that. There is where, someone has passed, and like you said, oftentimes the more minimalist type of organ donation is like skin and eyes and some of those things that they use for burn victims and things like that. And in those cases, there's not as much of a time constraint or, the condition of the body or age of the person, not as much per se. And there's a facility basically that will take the person, and that's done there. Then there's the deeper level to it, which is where someone might be, in the hospital. They've been pronounced brain dead. They are going to pull the plug, and through that process, the hospital will offer options where someone can do organ donations, especially if it's a younger person and they've got, good healthy kidneys, heart. People wait on transplant lists for long periods of time and unfortunately pass on those transplant lists. And so there are opportunities there where some of those actual organs can be utilized, and it does matter age, the condition of a person, and that kind of thing.
So if you die at home, then how do they get whatever you're donating?
So if you passed at home and it was more likely, like I mentioned, more like skin and eyes and that kind of thing, oftentimes we're still, because we're going to be the first call that happens, the hospice, if that's the case, they're going to contact us. We'll send someone out right away, bring that person into our care, and then the facilities or establishments that do the actual, harvesting, as they call it, will come and take care of that. Usually take the body from us and take care of it, and then bring them back. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, I thought Father was there. I was wondering if we get cremated and we have to keep the ashes together, how does the church view organ donating? Because we would be giving away parts of it.
I will be 100% honest with you. That is a question you'll have to direct to the priest there, to the church. Yeah, and that is a good question. That is a good question, and in fact, I'll have to follow up and see what the thought process and belief and the standard is there. But that's a good question. That one I can't answer. Yes, ma'am.
So if a person dies at home and they're not on hospice, is there a loss?
So yes, if a person passes away at home and they're not on hospice, it's what's called an unattended death. And in that case, you call the police. Even if, the person that finds the one that seemingly has passed away, feels very confident or knows that they've passed away, you still have to call police. The police will bring out a medical practitioner, IMSA, fire department, whatever that is. The police will also survey the scene, because again, remember, that's their only opportunity if there ever was foul play. And the medical practitioner will deem that a death really has occurred. And then the police, they'll survey the scene and they'll contact the medical examiner. And when they contact the medical examiner, they'll explain the circumstances of death, the age of the person, if there is any medical background information that they can give. They'll give that medical examiner all the information they need to make a determination to do one of two things. Either release the body, which means they're not worried about it. The medical examiner says, it's fine, take them. I don't need to do anything. And then there's where they do keep them. And if the medical examiner does want to look further into it just to make sure that there aren't any issues to be concerned about, then it doesn't always mean necessarily an autopsy. Sometimes it can be just toxicology and that kind of thing. But otherwise, most of the time, if a person's older and it's not somewhat just unexpected, the police, the ME will release. The police will actually call us for you, and they just ask, what funeral home do you want us to call? So they contact us, they give us all the information, who the next of kin is, all that, and then we come out. Yes?
How can it be handled if you have a plot in the city that your grandmother bought in the 1950s, and now you got nothing to do with that city or state anymore?
So you're
here now.
So your question is, if there's a different city or state where a family member, maybe mother or grandmother, had a plot that's available, but it's no longer where you live, and that was a long time ago, what can you do? So most cemeteries, as a rule, and I spent many years on the cemetery end as well, the way that works is the cemeteries don't just take them back. It doesn't mean after enough time passes, no one's claimed it, we get it back. What you have to do is you have to go in and prove you have the right to take that. Yeah. And what they'll usually do is they'll have what they call an affidavit of heirship showing who is the next of kin. And you literally have to write down, okay, it was my mother that passed. There were 5 kids. 3 are deceased. Here are the death certificates for those 3. 2 are living. You can have both of our signatures. And then you both have a 50% equal right in that, and you have to decide who gets it. That's kind of the scenario. It can be a little bit cumbersome. That's why I always tell people, if you know you'll have extra cemetery property or plots left over, figure out what to do with them. Don't just kind of, leave them and say what happens, happens. Sometimes you can donate them to the church, get a little bit of a tax write-off, and then the church, if they have, someone in the parish or congregation that can use that, it can be used that way. Or you go ahead and transfer it into the names of one of those children that you want, or you can actually sell them. May sound odd, but you can sell your cemetery property and advertise it, and usually you'll get more than what was paid years and years ago. So that's very doable. Yes, ma'am.
At Fitzgerald, so you, as a facility, are not involved with the cemeteries, the purchasing a plot, figuring out where you're going to put the ashes after a person's cremated, right? That's not your business.
That's a great question. So the question was, are we as a funeral home separate from the cemeteries, especially considering that, our Fitzgerald's Chapel next to Calvary, we're so close that people assume we're one and one. And same thing with our Moore's Chapel next to Memorial Park. People assume that we're the same entity, and we're not. So
The priest is back here, so we can ask the question about organ donation.
perfect. Oh, so the question was, she asked if the stance from the Catholic Church is that cremated remains need to stay together. Does organ donation affect that at all, or is that something that's an issue?
The church approves of organ donation, certainly, and understandably, it's part of a principle of sort of a holistic concept of the body. That it's like, well, we wouldn't ordinarily sacrifice an organ that would result in death or something, but after a person has died and their organs are being donated, that's considered that's a good thing to do, and so consequently, there's no problem with organ donation, and it does not affect, again, our understanding of the totality of the body, in terms of cremation or even if the body is going to be buried. The organ donation would be considered a morally acceptable thing. So.
Perfect. And so for any of those maybe watching on the stream that didn't catch that, the question originally was, is organ donation okay through the Catholic Church? And the short answer is yes. Whether you're buried, cremated, that is perfectly fine and a good thing to do. And going back to the cemeteries that are separate, they are separate from us, especially even though we get associated because we're so close and we work really well together. But when you're pre-planning, if you buy your plot, you buy it directly from the cemetery. If you're pre-planning your funeral, you do that directly with us. We're right next door to each other, and in fact, I've got good friends that work at both facilities, and I'll give them the name and even help set them up with an appointment. But you do make those cemetery arrangements independently at that cemetery for your plot, your marker, or headstone as they call it, and opening and closing of the grave. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about death certificates. How many do you need, and what kinds of things do you need them for?
That's a good question. So the question is, what are death certificates, used for? How many do you typically need? So we see now the average person needs about 5 death certificates. Some need more. The basis on that basically is a lot of places will take copies of that death certificate, but you need your originals primarily for financial institutions. So whether it be insurance policies, bank accounts, investments, IRAs, 401ks, if you have any mineral rights, oil rights, basically any entity that will pay out money, their main reason of wanting an original certified is to make sure they're not being frauded. But a lot of places will take copies. And I will tell you from experience, that has changed a lot even 10 years ago till now. Even 10, 15 years ago, it seemed like everybody took your original and you needed quite a few. It has gotten a lot better. Most people need about 5 on average. We can get more if you need them. But if people do have a lot of different investments and different things out there, some people do need upwards of 10. And I also tell people to take into account as well, sometimes, the surviving spouse or children, they may want still an extra one just to keep. Aside from needing it for business, they just want one to keep, an original. So you can usually factor that in as well. But 5 is the average. Any other questions? Okay. Well,
Just say thank you very much for your.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here, and it's my pleasure. And as I always say, this is not an easy subject to talk about, but I commend you all for coming in and taking that first step.